في عالم مليء بالتقلبات والمتغيرات، يجد الكثير منا نفسه في مواجهة تحديات مالية لا تنتهي. يشبه الأمر محاولة التنقل في غابة كثيفة دون خريطة، حيث كل خطوة قد تقود إلى نهاية غير متوقعة. ولكن ماذا لو قيل لكم أن هناك طريقة لام ريز فوق هذه التحديات، لام لوكينج من الأعلى، لتكشف عن الأخطاء الجسيمة التي قد تكون تكررها في إدارة ميزانيتك؟ هذه هي بداية رحلتنا اليوم في استكشاف كيفية تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى لتكثيف دخلك وزيادة رأس المال. تخيل أنك تقف على قمة جبل شاهق، تنظر إلى الأفق الذي يمتد أمامك. كل ما ترى عبارة عن خطوط متشابكة من الأخطاء والتجارب والنجاحات. هذه هي الصورة الشاملة لإدارة الميزانية. من هذه الارتفاع يمكنك رؤية كل شيء بوضوح، وتحديد بوينتس التي قد تكون تسبب في فقدانك للمال أو زيادة نفقاتك. ولكن عندما تنظر إلى الأسفل، إلى تفاصيل الحياة اليومية، يصبح من الصعب رؤية هذه النقاط بوضوح. هنا تكمن المشكلة، في عدم القدرة على رؤية الصورة الكبيرة، على تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى. الرؤية من الأعلى لا تعني فقط النظر إلى الأعلى، بل تعني أيضا النظر إلى الداخل. إنه بروسيس من التفكير العميق في إدارة ميزانيتك، في كيفية إنفاق أموالك، وفي الأخطاء التي قد تكون تكررها. يقال أن كل خطأ يحتوي على درس، وبالتالي كل خطأ في إدارة الميزانية يحتوي على فرصة لتعلم شيء جديد. ولكن كيف يمكن تطبيق هذه الرؤية في حياتنا اليومية؟ هذا سؤال يحتاج إلى إجابة، وإجابة عميقة. الخطأ الجسيم الأول في إدارة الميزانية هو عدم وجود خطة واضحة. يشبه الأمر السفر إلى بلد مجهول دون خريطة، دون معرفة الوجهة أو الطريق. بدون خطة، يصبح من الصعب تحديد أين تذهب أموالك، وأين يمكنك زيادة دخلك. خطة الميزانية هي مثل الخرائط التي تستخدمها لتنقل بين الشيء ورع، إنها توجيهك إلى الوجهة المناسبة. ولكن كيف يمكن إنشاء خطة فعالة؟ يجب أن تبدأ بتحليل دخلك وإنفاقك الحاليين، ومن ثم تحديد الأهداف المالية التي تريد تحقيقها. هذه الأهداف قد تكون قصيرة الأمد، مثل توفير المال لشراء سيارة جديدة، أو طويلة الأمد، مثل تأمين المال للتقاعد. الخطأ الجسيم الثاني هو عدم مراعاة التقلبات في الإنفاق. يشبه الأمر بناء منزل على رمل متحرك، حيث كل شيء يمكن أن يتغير في أي لحظة. التقلبات في الإنفاق يمكن أن تأتي من أي مكان، من زيادة أسعار المواد الغذائية إلى زيادة فواتير الكهرباء. إذا لم تكن مستعداً لهذه التقلبات، يمكن أن تأفى نفسك في مواجهة مشاكل مالية غير متوقعة. هنا يأتي دور الحفاظ على قدرة مالية لمواجهة هذه التقلبات. يجب أن تحتفظ بجزء من دخلك في حساب توفير، مثل خزينة طوارئ، حيث يمكنك النزول إليه في الأوقات الصعبة. هذه الخزينة لا يجب أن تكون كبيرة، بل يجب أن تكون كافية لتغطية نفقاتك الأساسية لمدة أشهر. بناء على هذه النقاط، يمكننا أن نرى كيف يمكن تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى في إدارة الميزانية. إنها مثل النظر إلى اللوحة الفنية من بعيد، حيث يمكنك رؤية كل شيء بوضوح. من هذه النقطة، يمكنك تحديد الأخطاء التي قد تكون تكررها، وبالتالي يمكنك كيشف تصحيحها. ولكن هذا ليس نهاية القصة، بل هو بداية رحلة جديدة في عالم إدارة الميزانية. في الجزء التالي، سنستمر في استكشاف المزيد من الخطوات والاستراتيجيات لتحسين إدارة ميزانيتك وزيادة دخلك. كانت هناك امرأة شابة تدعى أمينة، تعمل في شركة كبرى، وكانت مسؤولة عن إدارة الميزانية الخاصة بالشركة. كانت أمينة امرأة حازمة وذكية، لكنها كانت تعاني من مشكلة كبيرة، وهي عدم القدرة على التحكم في نفقاتها الشخصية. كانت أمينة تقوم بتخصيص ميزانية شهرية لشراء الأشياء التي تحتاجها، لكنها كانت دائما ما تفقد السيطرة على نفقاتها في النصف الثاني من الشهر. كانت أمينة تشعر بالخجل والضغط بسبب عدم القدرة على التحكم في نفقاتها، وكانت تخاف من أن يكتشف زملاؤها في العمل حقيقتها. كانت أمينة تحلم بأن تصبح امرأة مستقلة ماليا، وأن تتمكن من تحقيق أهدافها المالية دون أن تتعرض للضغط والخجل. لكن كانت أمينة لا تعرف كيف ستتمكن من تحقيق هذا الحلم، وكان لديها شعور بأنها فشلت في إدارة ميزانيتها الشخصية. في يوم من الأيام، قررت أمينة أن تطلب المساعدة من خبير مالي، الذي ساعدها على تحليل نفقاتها وتحديد الأخطاء التي كانت ترتكبها. كانت أمينة تشعر بالخوف من مواجهة حقيقتها المالية، لكن كان لديها الشجاعة للقيام بذلك. بعد تحليل نفقاتها، وجدت أمينة أن لديها عادة سيئة تتمثل في شراء الأشياء التي لا تحتاجها، وكان لديها أيضا عادة شراء الأشياء باهظة الثمن. بدأت أمينة بتحويل عاداتها السيئة، وبدأت بتخصيص ميزانية شهرية أكثر دقة، وكانت تقوم بتسجيل كل نفقة تقوم بها. كانت أمينة تشعر بالارتياح والرضا لأنها كانت تتمكن من التحكم في نفقاتها، وكانت تشعر بالفخر لأنها كانت تتمكن من تحقيق أهدافها المالية. بعد فترة من الوقت، استال أمينة امرأة مستقلة ماليا، وكانت تتمكن من تحقيق أهدافها المالية دون أن تتعرض للضغط والخجل. في وقت لاحق، كان هناك رجل أعمال ناجح يدعى عبد الرحمن، كان يمتلك شركة كبرى في مجال التكنولوجيا. كان عبد الرحمن رجلا ذكيا ومتحمسا، وكان لديه رؤية واضحة لمستقبل شركته. كان عبد الرحمن يعتقد أن النجاح يأتي من خلال العمل الجاد والتحليل الدقيق لأنماط السوق. كان عبد الرحمن يأبست على وقت طويل في تحليل البيانات ودراسة السوق، وكان يعتمد على استراتيجية ذكية لتحقيق أهدافه. كانت استراتيجية عبد الرحمن تتمثل في تحديد الفرص الجديدة في السوق، وبالتالي كان يتمكن من تحقيق أهدافه بسرعة. كان عبد الرحمن يعتمد على فريق من الخبراء الذين كانوا يساعدونه في تحليل البيانات ودراسة السوق. كان عبد الرحمن يعتقد أن الفريق الذي يعمل معه هو أحد أهم الأشياء التي تساهم في نجاحه، وكان يعتمد على فريقه لتحقيق أهدافه. كانت شركة عبد الرحمن تتمتع بنمو سريع ومستمر، وكان يعتبر أحد أهم الشركات في مجال التكنولوجيا. كان عبد الرحمن يعتقد أن النجاح يأتي من خلال العمل الجاد والتحليل الدقيق لأنماط السوق، وكان يعتمد على استراتيجية ذكية لتحقيق أهدافه. بعد فترة من الوقت، أصبح عبد الرحمن واحدا من أهم رواد الأعمال في العالم، وكان يعتبر نموذجا للمسؤولية والنجاح. في النهاية، كان هناك عالم مشهور يدعى محمد، كان يعمل في مجال الفيزياء النووية. كان محمد عالما بارعا ومثقفا، وكان لديه رؤية واضحة لمستقبل العلوم. كان محمد يعتقد أن العلم هو أحد أهم الأشياء التي تساهم في تقدم البشرية، وكان يعتمد على استراتيجية ذكية لتحقيق أهدافه. كان محمد يعتمد على فريق من العلماء الذين كانوا يساعدونه في تحليل البيانات ودراسة الظواهر الطبيعية. كانت استراتيجية محمد تتمثل في تحديد الفرص الجديدة في مجال الفيزياء النووية، وبالتالي كان يتمكن من تحقيق أهدافه بسرعة. كان محمد يعتقد أن الفريق الذي يعمل معه هو أحد أهم الأشياء التي تساهم في نجاحه، وكان يعتمد على فريقه لتحقيق أهدافه. كان محمد يعتقد أن العلم هو أحد أهم الأشياء التي تساهم في تقدم البشرية، وكان يعتمد على استراتيجية ذكية لتحقيق أهدافه. كانت المساهمات التي قدمها محمد في مجال الفيزياء النووية هائلة، وكان يعتبر أحد أهم العلماء في العالم. كان محمد يعتقد أن العلم هو أحد أهم الأشياء التي تساهم في تقدم البشرية، وكان يعتمد على استراتيجية ذكية لتحقيق أهدافه. بعد فترة من الوقت، أصبح محمد واحدا من أهم العلماء في العالم، وكان يعتبر نموذجا للمسؤولية والنجاح. في الجزء الثالث والأخير من هذا الفيلم، نصل إلى النقطة الأكثر أهمية، وهي كيفية تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى لتكثيف دخلك وزيادة رأس المال. إن هذا الجزء هو الأكثر تحدياً، لأنه يتطلب تغييراً جذرياً في طريقة تفكيرك وتصرفك. الخطأ الجسيم في إدارة الميزانية هو أن الناس يعتقدون أن زيادة الدخل هو الحل الوحيد لمشاكلهم المالية. ومع ذلك، فإن زيادة الدخل دون التحكم في النفقات والاستثمارات يمكن أن يؤدي إلى تفاقم المشاكل المالية. لذلك، يجب أن نركز على تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى لتحليل نفقاتنا وزيادة دخلك بشكل فعال. أولاً، يجب أن نبدأ بتحليل نفقاتنا الشهرية. يجب أن نحدد النفقات الثابتة والمتغيرة، ونحدد النفقات التي يمكننا تقليلها أو إلغاؤها. ثم، يجب أن نحدد مصادر دخلك ونتأكد من أنها مستدامة ويمكن توسيعها. بعد ذلك، يجب أن نضع خطة لزيادة دخلك، سواء كان ذلك من خلال زيادة الأجور أو إطلاق مشروع جديد. ثانياً، يجب أن نركز على تقليل النفقات وزيادة الادخار. يجب أن نحدد النفقات التي لا لزوم لها ونتوقف عنها، ونبدأ في توفير الأموال في حساب التوفير أو الاستثمار. يجب أن نكون حذرين في اختيار الاستثمارات، ونتأكد من أنها آمنة ومستدامة. ثالثاً، يجب أن نركز على زيادة رأس المال. يجب أن نستثمر في نفسنا، ونطور مهاراتنا وخبراتنا لزيادة فرصنا في السوق العمل. يجب أن نبحث عن فرص جديدة للاستثمار، سواء كان ذلك في الأسهم أو السندات أو المشاريع الصغيرة. أخيراً، يجب أن نكون صبورين ومتحملين. تطبيق الرؤية من الأعلى لتكثيف دخلك وزيادة رأس المال يتطلب وقتاً وجهداً. يجب أن نكون مستعدين للتعلم والتحسين المستمر، ونجب أن نكون حذرين في اتخاذ القرارات المالية. وأخيراً، كما قال الفيلسوف الألماني، الشجاعة ليست غياب الخوف، ولكن الشجاعة هي القدرة على التغلب على الخوف. يجب أن نكون شجعان في مواجهة التحديات المالية، ونجب أن نكون مستعدين للعمل الجاد والتضحية من أجل تحقيق أهدافنا المالية. الفرصة لا تأتي مرتين، يجب أن نكون مستعدين للاستفادة منها.
To bombard the Western Army's positions, seeking to weaken their defenses and create breaches in their lines. The Eastern Army's 6th and final battalion, consisting of reserve troops, held back, awaiting the opportune moment to strike, their formations poised and ready to be committed to the fray at a moment's notice. As the battle reached its crescendo, the Eastern Army's commander, perched atop a nearby hill, surveyed the unfolding drama, his eyes scanning the battlefield as he sought to identify the weak points in the Western Army's defenses. The Eastern Army's vanguard, having advanced to within striking distance of the Western Army's lines, began to prepare for the final assault. The heavily armored warriors, their shields locked and their swords at the ready, charged forward with a thunderous roar, seeking to shatter the Western Army's defenses and claim victory. The Western Army, however, stood firm, their shield wall holding strong against the Eastern Army's onslaught. The battle raged on, the two armies clashed in a frenzy of steel and blood, each side seeking to outmaneuver and outfight the other. As the day wore on, the Eastern Army's flanking maneuver began to bear fruit, the lightly armored infantry and cavalry exploiting the weaknesses in the Western Army's defenses and striking at their vulnerable flanks. The Western Army, however, refused to yield, their commander rallying his troops and urging them to hold firm against the Eastern Army's relentless carry-ons. The battle continued, the two armies locked in a struggle that would determine the fate of the war, each side seeking to outlast and outmaneuver the other in a conflict that would be remembered for generations to come. The Eastern Army's siege engineers, meanwhile, continued to bombard the Western Army's positions, seeking to weaken their defenses and create breaches in their lines. The Western Army's archers, however, returned fire, their arrows and bolts striking the Eastern Army's siege engines and seeking to silence their deadly bombardment. The Eastern Army's cavalry, comprising of heavily armored knights, charged forward, seeking to break through the Western Army's lines and claim victory. The Western Army's cavalry, however, stood firm, their lances and bows at the ready, as they prepared to meet the Eastern Army's onslaught. As the battle raged on, the Eastern Army's commander began to commit his reserve troops to the fray, the 6th Battalion advancing to support the other battalions and strike the final blow. The Western Army, however, refused to yield, their commander rallying his troops and urging them to hold firm against the Eastern Army's relentless onslaught. The battle continued, the two armies clashed in a frenzy of steel and blood, each side seeking to outmaneuver and outfight the other in a conflict that would determine the fate of the war. The Eastern Army's tactics, devised by their seasoned commander, had been designed to outmaneuver and out-flank the Western Army, exploiting their weaknesses and striking at their vulnerable points. The Western Army, however, had anticipated this strategy and had devised a counterplan to neutralize the Eastern Army's advantage. The battle, as a result, had become a complex and intricate dance, each side seeking to outmaneuver and outfight the other in a conflict that would be remembered for generations to come. As the day wore on, the Eastern Army's flanking maneuver began to bear fruit, the lightly armored infantry and cavalry exploiting the weaknesses in the Western Army's defenses and striking at their vulnerable flanks. The Western Army, however, refused to yield, their commander rallying his troops and urging them to hold firm against the Eastern Army's relentless onslaught. The battle continued, the two armies locked in a struggle that would determine the fate of the war, each side seeking to outlast and outmaneuver the other in a conflict that would be etched into the annals of history. The Eastern Army's commander, perched atop a nearby hill, surveyed the unfolding drama, his eyes scanning the battlefield as he sought to identify the weak points in the Western Army's defenses. The Western Army's commander, meanwhile, stood firm, his eyes fixed on the Eastern Army's lines as he sought to rally his troops and urge them to hold firm against the Eastern Army's onslaught. The battle raged on, the two armies clashed in a frenzy of steel and blood, each side seeking to outmain and outfight the other in a conflict that would determine the fate of the war. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, the Eastern Army's commander made a final, desperate bid to claim victory. The 6th Battalion, comprising of reserve troops, was committed to the fray, advancing to support the other battalions and strike the final blow. The Western Army, however, stood firm, their commander rallying his troops and urging them to hold firm against the Eastern Army's relentless onslaught. The battle continued, the two armies locked in a struggle that would determine the fate of the war, each side seeking to outlast and outmaneuver the other in a conflict that would be remembered for generations to come. As the Allied forces pressed onward, the cacophony of war erupted around them. The staccato bursts of machine gun fire, the thunderous boom of artillery, and the screams of the wounded created a maelstrom of chaos that threatened to consume them all. The M4 Sherman tanks, with their 75mm M3L40 guns, churned forward, their treads screeching in protest as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The tank commanders, peering out from their open hatches, scanned the horizon for any sign of the enemy, their eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. To their left, a platoon of infantrymen, armed with Mer1 Garand rifles and M1 carbines, moved cautiously through the dense underbrush, their senses on high alert for any sign of enemy movement. The sole Diders, helmets, adorned with the distinctive insignia of their unit, seemed to blend seamlessly into the surrounding foliage, making them all but invisible to the naked eye. As they advanced, they encountered pockets of German resistance, and the air was filled with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the mournful wail of the wounded. Meanwhile, a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts, their Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines roaring like lions, screamed down from the sky, their 8x.50 calories M2 Browning machine guns blazing as they strafed the enemy positions. The Thunderbolts, with their distinctive razorback silhouette, seemed to embody the very essence of American air power, their pilots pushing the limits of their machines as they dove and swooped through the chaos below. The explosions that rocked the ground as the planes released their payload of 500-pound bombs sent shockwaves through the earth, throwing men and machines alike off balance. As the battle raged on, the logistics of war began to take their toll. The supply chain, that vital lifeline that sustained the Allied forces, was beginning to fray at the edges. Ammunition and fuel, those most precious of commodities, were in short supply, and the quartermasters were working around the clock to replenish the stocks. The truck drivers, those unsung heroes of the war effort, were driving day and night, their vehicles laden with the necessities of war, as they navigated the treacherous roads and byways of the battlefield. In the midst of this chaos, a lone M26 Pershing tank, its 90mm M3 gun at the ready, moved cautiously through the wreckage-strewn streets of a bombed-out town. The tank's commander, a grizzled veteran of the North African campaign, peered out from his hatch, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The Pershing, with its sleek, streamlined design, seemed to embody the very essence of American armored doctrine, its combination of firepower and mobility, making it a formidable opponent on the battlefield. As the tank moved forward, it encountered a group of German Panzer Grenadiers, their FG-42 rifles at the ready. The Grenadiers, with their distinctive helmets and camouflage smocks, seemed to blend seamlessly into the surrounding environment, making them all but invisible to the naked eye. The tank commander, his senses on high alert, spotted the Grenadiers and gave the order to fire. The M3 gun roared to life, its 90mm shell screaming downrange as it struck the Grenadiers with devastating force. The explosion that followed was immense, sending shrapnel flying in all directions as the Grenadiers were torn apart by the blast. The tank commander, his ears ringing from the explosion, gave the order to move forward, the Pershing's tracks screeching in protest as it navigated the rubble-strewn streets. As the tank moved onward, it encountered more and more pockets of enemy resistance, each one more determined than the last to hold their ground against the Allied onslaught. The battle was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a never-ending tapestry of chaos and destruction that seemed to have no end. The smell of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of cordite and the sweet, sickly scent of blood. The men, their faces blackened with grime and exhaustion, fought on, driven by a mixture of adrenaline and sheer, unadulterated fury. As the day wore on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand, their superior firepower and numbers telling as the enemy lines began to waver and break. The Germans, their defenses stretched to the breaking point, were beginning to fall back, their movements becoming more and more disorganized as the Allies pressed their advantage. The P-47 Thunderbolts, those tireless workhorses of the air war, continued to pound the enemy positions, their machine guns blazing as they strafed the retreating Germans. In the midst of this chaos, a group of Allied soldiers, their faces set with determination, moved forward, their rifles at the ready. They were the vanguard of the Allied advance, the tip of the spear that would ultimately shatter the enemy lines and bring the war to a close. As they moved onward, they encountered more and more signs of enemy resistance, each one a reminder that the war was far from over. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the air, a constant reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The soldiers, their senses on high alert, moved cautiously through the wreckage-strewn landscape, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. They were a team, a well-oiled machine that had been honed to perfection through months of training and combat. Each man knew his role, and they worked together with a precision that was almost choreographed. As they moved forward, they encountered a group of German soldiers, their rifles raised in surrender. The Allied soldiers, their faces set with a mixture of relief and suspicion, moved forward, their rifles at the ready. They had seen it before, the enemy's tendency to surrender and then turn on their captors at the first opportunity. But as they approached the Germans, they saw the defeat in their eyes, the knowledge that the war was lost and that they were beaten. The Allies took the Germans prisoner, their hands raised in surrender as they were led away from the battlefield. As the day drew to a close, the Allies had gained a significant advantage, their lines pushing deep into enemy territory. The Germans, their defenses breached and their army in disarray, were reeling from the blows that had been struck against them. The stage was set for a final, decisive showdown, one that would determine the outcome of the war and the fate of Europe. The Allies, their momentum building, were poised to deliver the final blow, to shatter the enemy lines and bring the war to a close. But the Germans, their backs against the wall, were not yet ready to surrender, and the battle would rage on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a bloody orange glow over the ravaged landscape, the battle reached its fever pitch. The air was electric with tension, the very atmosphere thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and blood. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, a haunting cacophony that pierced the eardrums and rent the soul. Every second seemed to stretch out into an eternity, as if time itself was being warped and distorted by the sheer intensity of the conflict. The soldiers on both sides were reduced to mere automatons, their faces contorted with fear, their eyes vacant and unseeing. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their limbs twitching and spasming as they stumbled forward into the maelstrom. The ground beneath their feet was a churned-up morass of mud, blood, and shattered earth, making every step a perilous journey into the unknown. The sound of gunfire and explosions was a constant, deafening roar, a never-ending barrage that threatened to consume everything in its path. To the left, a platoon of infantrymen was pinned down behind a crumbling wall, their rifles firing in ragged bursts as they tried to hold back the enemy tide. The wall was a fragile, makeshift thing, its stones cracked and broken, and it seemed to shudder and tremble with each incoming round. The men crouched behind it, their faces pressed into the dirt, their fingers white-knuckled as they clutched their rifles. Were a mixture of seasoned veterans and green recruits, but in this moment, they were all equal, united in their fear and their determination to survive. On the right, a team of medics was desperately trying to tend to the wounded, their hands moving with a speed and precision that belied the chaos around them. They worked in a small, cramped clearing, surrounded by the detritus of war, shattered equipment, discarded uniforms, and the broken bodies of the fallen. The medics themselves were covered in blood and grime, their faces drawn and exhausted, but they worked on, driven by a fierce dedication to their craft. They were the only ones who seemed to be moving with a sense of purpose, their actions a beacon of hope in a world gone mad. In the center, the commander stood tall, his eyes fixed intently on the enemy lines as he bellowed orders into the radio. His voice was hoarse and cracked, his throat parched and dry, but he kept shouting, kept pushing his men forward, even as the odds seemed to grow more and more insurmountable. He was a towering figure, his presence seeming to draw the eye like a magnet, and his men responded to him, their movements becoming more coordinated and focused as they rallied around their leader. The enemy, too, was beginning to stir, their own commander pushing them forward with a series of fierce, exhortatory cries. The two forces were now barely 100 yards apart, the space between them, a killing zone, a no-man's land of shattered earth, a twisted metal. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone, the very atmosphere seeming to vibrate with tension as the two sides faced off. It was a moment of perfect, crystalline clarity, a moment when the entire outcome of the battle seemed to hang in the balance. And then, in an instant, the world exploded. A shell screamed in, its roar growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire universe. The ground shook and trembled, the earth seeming to split apart as the shell detonated with a deafening crash. The blast wave ripped through the clearing, sending men flying, their bodies torn and broken as they were hurled through the air. The sound was a living thing, a monstrous, screaming creature that wrapped itself around the eardrums and squeezed tight. When the dust finally began to settle, the battlefield was a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, their limbs twisted and broken, their faces frozen in death. The wall behind which the infantrymen had taken cover was now nothing more than a pile of rubble, the stones scattered and broken. The medics were still working, their movements swift and precise as they tended to the wounded. But their task seemed almost hopeless, the sheer scale of the carnage threatening to overwhelm them. The commander stood tall, his eyes scanning the horizon as he took stock of the situation. His face was grim and set, his jaw clenched in determination. He knew that the battle was far from over, or that the enemy was still out there, waiting to strike. But he also knew that his men were beginning to tire, their bodies worn down by the endless fighting. He needed to come up with a new plan, and fast, or risk losing everything they had gained. As he pondered his next move, a messenger stumbled into the clearing, his face white and shaken. He saluted the commander, his eyes wide with fear, and handed him a sheet of paper. The commander took it, his eyes scanning the message, and then his face set in a fierce, determined expression. He turned to his men, his voice ringing out across the clearing, and began to issue new orders, his words a call to action, a rallying cry in the face of overwhelming odds. Lokines. The men responded, their faces set, their eyes burning with determination. They knew that the battle was far from over, that the enemy was still out there, waiting to strike. But they also knew that they had come too far to turn back now, that they had to see this through to the end. They moved forward, their rifles at the ready, their hearts pounding in their chests. The outcome of the battle was still far from certain, but one thing was clear: only one side could emerge victorious. The question was, which one would it be? The next few minutes would be crucial, as the two sides clashed in a frenzy of gunfire and explosions. The air would be thick with the smell of smoke and blood, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The soldiers would be reduced to mere automatons, their movements driven by instinct and training. It would be a battle to the death, with no quarter asked or given. The commander's plan was to outflank the enemy, to catch them off guard and strike at their weak point. But the enemy was not going to go down without a fight, and they would stop at nothing to emerge victorious. As the two sides clashed, the sound of gunfire and explosions would grow louder, the earth shaking beneath their feet. The battle would be a chaotic, confused mess, with men screaming and shouting, their rifles firing wildly. The commander would be in the thick of it, his eyes fixed intently on the enemy lines as he directed his men. He would be a towering figure, his presence seeming to draw the eye like a magnet. And his men would respond to him, their movements becoming more coordinated and focused as they rallied around their leader. But despite their bravery, the outcome of the battle was still far from certain. The enemy was strong, their defenses well entrenched, and they would not give up easily. The commander's plan was a good one, but it was not without its risks, and there was always a chance that it could go horribly wrong. The next few minutes would be crucial, as the two sides clashed in a frenzy of gunfire and explosions. The air would be thick with the smell of smoke and blood, the ground shaking beneath their feet. It would be a battle to the death, with no quarter asked or given. The soldiers on both sides were aware of the stakes, and they fought with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They were driven by a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and duty, and they would stop at nothing to emerge victorious. The commander's plan was to outflank the enemy, to catch them off guard, and strike at their weak point. But the enemy was not going to go down without a fight, and they would do everything in their power to prevent it. As the battle raged on, the chaos and confusion grew. Men were screaming and shouting, their rifles firing wildly, and the earth was shaking beneath their feet. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, and the sound of gunfire and explosions was deafening. It was a scene of utter devastation, with bodies lying strewn across the ground, their limbs twisted and broken. The outcome of the battle was still far from certain, but one thing was clear: only one side could emerge victorious. The question was, which one would it be? The commander's plan was to keep pushing forward, to keep the enemy off balance, and prevent them from regrouping. He knew that if they could just keep the momentum going, they might be able to break through the enemy lines and emerge victorious. But it was a risky plan, and there was always a chance that it could go horribly wrong. The enemy was strong, their defenses well entrenched, and they would not give up easily. As the battle raged on, the commander's men began to tire. They had been fighting for hours, and they were starting to feel the strain. Their bodies were worn down, their muscles aching, and their minds were foggy with exhaustion. But they knew that they couldn't give up now. Not when they had come so far. They gritted their teeth, summoned up their last ounce of strength, and pushed forward, their rifles firing wildly as they charged into the fray. The enemy was waiting for them, their defenses strong and well entrenched. They fired back, their rifles and machine guns blazing, and the commander's men were cut down, their bodies falling to the ground. But the commander didn't falter, didn't hesitate. He kept pushing forward, his eyes fixed intently on the enemy lines, his voice ringing out across the battlefield as he directed his men. The battle was a chaotic, confused mess, with men screaming and shouting, their rifles firing wildly at them. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, the ground shaking beneath their feet. It was a scene of utter devastation, with bodies lying strewn across the ground, their limbs twisted and broken. But the commander didn't see it, didn't hear it. He was focused on one thing, and one thing only: winning the battle. And then, in an instant, it was over. The enemy lines broke, their defenses crumbling, and the commander's men poured through the gap, their rifles firing triumphantly as they claimed victory. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, the ground shaking beneath their feet, but the commander didn't notice. He was too busy, too caught up in the moment, as he surveyed the battlefield, his eyes taking in the sheer scale of the carnage. The battle was won, but at what cost? The ground was littered with bodies, the earth churned up and broken, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, and the sound of gunfire and explosions still echoed through the air. The commander's men were exhausted, their bodies worn down, their minds foggy with exhaustion. But they had won, and that was all that mattered. As the commander stood victorious on the battlefield, he knew that the war was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to defeat. But for now, he could rest, could take a moment to catch his breath and survey the damage. The battle was won, and that was all that mattered. The cost would be counted later, the dead and wounded tended to, the damage assessed. But for now, the commander just stood, his eyes fixed intently on the horizon, his heart still racing with the adrenaline of battle. As the dust settled, the true extent of the devastation became apparent. The once thriving city was now a smoldering ruin, its buildings reduced to rubble, its streets littered with the bodies of the dead and the dying. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and ash, and the only sounds were the moans of the wounded and the crackle of flames. The first reports of casualties began to trickle in, and they were staggering. Entire units had been wiped out, their soldiers cut down by the pataste, fearing enemy fire or buried under the rubble of collapsing buildings. The medical teams were quickly overwhelmed, struggling to cope with the sheer number of wounded soldiers who needed treatment. One of the first stories to emerge was that of Private Johnson, a young soldier who had been part of the initial assault on the city. He had been hit by shrapnel in the leg and had managed to crawl to safety, but not before seeing his entire squad cut down around him. As he lay in the makeshift hospital, his leg wrapped in a bloody bandage, he recounted the horror of what he had witnessed. "I was right behind Sergeant Thompson when he went down," Johnson said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I tried to reach him, but there were just too many bullets flying around. I had to keep moving, or I would have been next. I saw some of the other guys trying to take cover, but it was like the enemy was everywhere. They just kept coming, no matter how many we took out." Another survivor, Corporal Rodriguez, had been part of a team that had been tasked with securing a key intersection in the city. They had come under heavy fire, and Rodriguez had been forced to take cover in a nearby alleyway. From there, he had watched in horror as his teammates were picked off one by one. "I was stuck in that alleyway for what felt like hours," Rodriguez said, his eyes haunted by the memories. "I could hear the enemy moving around trying to flush me out. I knew I had to keep moving, or I would be trapped. So I made a break for it, dashing across the street to a nearby building. I didn't stop running until I was sure I was safe." As the day wore on, more and more stories like these began to emerge. Each one was a testament to the bravery and resilience of the soldiers who had fought in the battle, and each one was a reminder of the devastating cost of war. The city was a graveyard, filled with the bodies of the dead and the dying. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, to try and make sense of the senseless carnage that had been unleashed upon them. The commanders, too, were struggling to come to terms with the scale of the disaster. They had expected a tough fight, but nothing could have prepared them for the ferocity of the enemy's resistance. As they surveyed the ruins of the city, they knew that they had underestimated the enemy's strength and determination. "We thought we had the upper hand," admitted General Smith, his voice laced with regret. "We thought we could take the city quickly and easily, but we were wrong. The enemy was stronger than we anticipated, and they fought with a ferocity that we couldn't match. We paid the price for our arrogance, and now we have to deal with the consequences." As the night wore on, the survivors huddled together, trying to stay warm and safe. They knew that the enemy was still out there, waiting to strike. And they knew that they had to be vigilant. But for now, they just tried to rest, to process the trauma they had experienced, and to mourn the loss of their comrades. The city was a tomb, a monument to the fallen soldiers who had given their lives in the battle. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, to try and rebuild, and to wonder what the future held. Would they be able to recover from this devastating defeat? Or would it mark the beginning of the end? Only time would tell. In the midst of the chaos and destruction, a small group of soldiers stumbled upon a makeshift hospital, where doctors and nurses were working tirelessly to save the lives of the wounded. The soldiers were greeted by the horrific sight of rows of makeshift beds, each one filled with a young soldier, their bodies broken and battered. One of the soldiers, a young lieutenant, was struck by the sheer scale of the suffering. He had seen some terrible things in his time as a soldier, but nothing could have prepared him for this. As he walked through the hospital, he saw soldiers with limbs missing, soldiers with horrific burns, and soldiers who had been shot multiple times. The lieutenant was approached by one of the doctors, a weary-looking woman with a kind face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The lieutenant shook his head. "I'm just here to help," he said. "What can I do?" The doctor nodded. "We need all the help we can get. We're overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, and we don't have enough staff to care for them all. Can you help us with the triage process?" The lieutenant nodded, and together with the doctor he set to work sorting through the wounded soldiers, prioritizing those who needed the most urgent care. It was a heartbreaking task, but it was one that needed to be done. As the night wore on, the lieutenant found himself becoming increasingly desensitized to the suffering around him. He had seen so many terrible things, and he had witnessed so much pain and trauma, that he was starting to feel numb. But then, he saw a young soldier, no more than 20 years old, who had been hit by a bullet in the chest. The soldier was struggling to breathe, and his eyes were filled with a desperate fear. The lieutenant felt a surge of emotion, and he knelt down beside the soldier. "You're going to be okay," he said, trying to reassure him. "We're going to get you through this." The soldier looked up at him.